In the tranquil and serene village of Omoni, nestled between lush green hills and flowing rivers, the people lived in harmony with nature and their traditions. The heart of the village was its royal family, King Douglas and his beloved wife, Queen Margaret. Their love was the foundation of the village, and their marriage had been a long and joyous one. Yet, there was one thing they deeply desired, a child. For 10 long years, they had tried and prayed for an heir to carry on the royal lineage, but their prayers seemed unanswered. The villagers sympathized with the royal couple, who, despite their wealth and status, faced the pain of childlessness. But fate, as it often does, smiled upon them when Queen Margaret found herself with child. The entire village rejoiced. The drums of celebration echoed through the village square as the king and queen shared their joyous news. The king, proud and hopeful, believed that the birth of their son would solidify his legacy and secure the future of Omoni. The day of Queen Margaret's delivery was nothing short of a spectacle. In the grand palace, surrounded by servants and well-wishers, the queen gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The cry of the newborn echoed through the halls of the palace, and it was as if the very earth itself had rejoiced with them. The village was in a state of festivity, with feasts, music, and dances in the royal palace. The elders and the people of Omoni gathered, offering blessings and prayers for the newborn. It was truly a moment of great joy. But, according to the village traditions, there was one final step before the child's future could be secured. Once a male child was born to a royal family, the tradition was to take the child to the village's native doctor, the chief priest. It was believed that the chief priest, through ancient rituals and incantations, would divine the child's future and reveal whether it would be one filled with prosperity or misfortune. King Douglas, Queen Margaret, and their entourage set out to the chief priest's humble abode deep within the village's heart, where the air always felt thick with mystery. The elders and guards followed, whispering prayers of protection and blessing for the child. When they arrived at the chief priest's home, an eerie silence descended. The village doctor was a man of few words, but his presence spoke volumes. The chief priest took the baby in his arms, his face grave and his movements deliberate. With a deep breath, he began the ancient incantations, murmuring words known only to the gods and the spirits that roamed the earth. For what seemed like an eternity, the chief priest swayed and chanted, his hands raised to the heavens. Finally, he stopped, his face clouded with a look of foreboding. The king, the queen, and the gathered elders leaned in, awaiting his words, but no one could have prepared them for what came next. This child, the chief priest said in a voice that reverberated through the forest, will eliminate his father and marry his mother. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. The elders, who had lived through decades of traditions and customs, could not believe their ears. They erupted into an uproar, shouting in disbelief. "Abomination! Abomination!" they cried, clutching their chests in horror. The chief priest remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on the child. He continued, his voice now filled with grim finality. "This child's fate is sealed. To save the kingdom, to save the village, he must be taken to the evil forest and left to perish. Only then can we avert the disaster foretold." The king's face paled, and Queen Margaret's knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, her cries echoing through the forest. Her dreams of raising a son, of having an heir, seemed to vanish in an instant. The pain of losing the child she had longed for was unbearable. The village elders rushed to console her, offering empty words of comfort. "You will have another child," they said, "one with a better fate." But the queen's heart was heavy, her soul shattered by the prophecy. She clung to her husband, her body racked with sobs. The king, a man who had once been strong and unyielding, now stood powerless, his mind whirling with the impossible choice before him. The chief priest's words echoed in the king's ears, and though his love for his son was deep, the weight of tradition and the village's beliefs crushed him. He turned away from his wife, his heart torn between the love for his child and the duty to his kingdom. That night, the village was still. The usual sounds of celebration were replaced by a heavy silence. In the royal palace, Queen Margaret cried herself to sleep, the weight of the prophecy bearing down on her. And outside, the moon shone brightly, casting long shadows over the land, as if even the stars themselves mourned the loss of the future they had dreamed of. The fate of little baby hung in the balance, and in the hearts of the king and queen, the future of their kingdom seemed uncertain. What was to come would change the village of Obio forever, and the choices made in the days that followed would have consequences beyond imagination. That night, as the royal palace slept under the gentle glow of the moon, King Douglas sat by the crib where the baby lay soundly asleep. The soft rise and fall of the baby's chest filled the otherwise silent room, but the king's mind was far from at peace. The words of the chief priest echoed relentlessly in his head, louder with each passing moment, drowning out the peaceful innocence of the sleeping child. This child will eliminate his father and marry his mother. King Douglas' heart clenched at the thought. He looked at the baby, so small, so vulnerable, and his gut twisted in a knot. How could this be the fate of his son? How could this prophecy, so chilling in its certainty, be allowed to come to pass? But in the world of Obio, fate was not something to be ignored. The traditions were clear, and the elders, in their wisdom, had agreed that the prophecy must be fulfilled. But it was a difficult decision for a father to make. The love he felt for his son, this miracle after so many years, tugged at his very soul. King Douglas knew that the chief priest's words were not to be taken lightly. To ignore them would risk calamity for the entire village. Yet, deep inside, he prayed for a way to save his son. The next morning, the heavy toll of responsibility weighed upon the king. The elders gathered in the palace, their faces grim as they awaited the king's decision. It was clear that there was no turning back now. King Douglas summoned 2 trusted palace guards, men who had served him for many years, and gave them their instructions. "You will take the child to the evil forest," the king ordered, his voice strained with anguish. "Do not return without completing this task. It is the only way to ensure the safety of the kingdom." The guards bowed respectfully, though their faces betrayed a sense of dread. They had never been asked to carry out such a dreadful task. As they made their way through the dense forest, the baby's cries filled the air, piercing and loud. His voice, filled with confusion and fear, tugged at the guards' hearts. But they had been given a duty, one that, in their minds, left no room for compassion. The forest loomed before them, a dark and ominous place known to all as the evil forest, where many things were left to perish. The guards stopped at its edge, and for a moment they hesitated. The child's cries grew louder, the sound so raw and innocent that it seemed to reach into their very souls. "Can we really do this?" one of the guards whispered, his voice shaky. His companion looked at him, his expression hardened. "We have no choice. The king has spoken. The prophecy must be fulfilled." But as they stood there, unsure of what to do, a strange silence fell between them. The baby's cries seemed to echo through the trees, as if the very forest itself mourned the fate that awaited the innocent child. After several moments of conflicted silence, the guards exchanged a look. With one final, reluctant glance at the baby, they made a decision, one they would regret for the rest of their lives. They set the child down gently on the forest floor, hoping that his cries would be enough to alert someone to his presence. They knew that leaving him in the heart of the forest meant that he would surely perish, but they could not bring themselves to take the final step. With one last, sorrowful glance, they turned and walked away, their hearts heavy with guilt. Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. Deep within the shadows of the forest, a rustling noise broke the silence. The baby's cries had caught the attention of someone, a man, a hunter, who had long known the solitude of the forest. His name was Uzo, and like the king, he had lived many years without children. He had watched his peers raise their families, but his own arms remained empty, the absence of a child something he had grown accustomed to. When Uzo heard the sound of the baby's cries, his heart leaped with surprise. What could this mean? The sound led him through the trees, and soon he found himself standing over the abandoned child. He looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. It was as if the child had been left here by the gods themselves. Uzo knelt down and gently scooped the baby into his arms. He looked at the innocent face, the eyes closed in sleep, unaware of the world he had just been thrust into. The hunter's heart softened as he gazed at the child, feeling an inexplicable connection to him. This child. He should not be here, Uzo murmured to himself, his voice filled with both wonder and sorrow. With careful hands, Uzo carried the baby back to his home, his mind racing. His wife, Adiz, was in the small hut they called home, tending to their daily tasks. When she saw her husband arrive with the child, her eyes widened in shock. Uzo. What is this? Where did you find him? She asked, rushing to his side. I found him in the forest. Abandoned, Uzo replied, his voice heavy with emotion. I couldn't leave him there. He needs help. He needs a family. Adiz gazed at the child, her heart immediately filled with compassion. What will we do with him? She asked, her voice trembling. Uzo looked down at the child, then back at his wife. We will raise him as our own. He is a gift from the gods. We will name him Patrick, and he will be the child we never had. And so, little Patrick was taken in by Uzo and Adiz, who loved him as their own flesh and blood. They taught him the ways of the forest, the lessons of survival, and the values of love and kindness. They watched him grow from a fragile infant into a strong, vibrant boy, full of curiosity and energy. Patrick had no knowledge of his true origins. The only family he knew were the people who raised him, Uzo and Adiz. As the years passed, he flourished in their care, unaware of the dark prophecy that had once surrounded his life. Yet, deep within the forest of EBUBE, the secrets of his birth were waiting to be uncovered. Many years passed, and Patrick grew into a strong and hardworking man. He had learned all the skills needed to survive in the forest, and his parents, Uzo and Adiz, were proud of the man he had become. He was known across the village for his strength and determination, but there was one thing that held him back, his temper. Patrick had a very hot temper. Sometimes, it would get so bad that he would lose control of himself, and the anger would take over. This made him the subject of gossip in the village, as people often wondered what could be done to calm his fiery spirit. But despite this flaw, Patrick worked hard every day, and his heart was good. He loved his parents, Uzo and Adiz, with all his heart, and would do anything to make them proud. One day, Patrick grew restless. Something inside him told him that his life was about to take a turn, and he needed to know what the future held. In secret, he decided to visit a native doctor, someone who could tell him about his fate. Patrick believed that if he knew what was coming, he could avoid whatever bad things were destined for him. When he arrived at the native doctor's hut, the old man welcomed him with a mysterious smile. What brings you here, my son? The native doctor asked. Patrick, a bit nervous, explained, I want to know about my future. I have heard things about myself, and I need to know the truth. Can you tell me what lies ahead for me? The native doctor didn't speak for a moment. He closed his eyes, muttered a few words under his breath, and began performing some incantations. The air around them grew thick with mystery. When the ritual was finished, the doctor opened his eyes, and his voice was grave. Your future is dark, young man, the doctor said slowly. You will eliminate your father and marry your mother. Patrick's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened with shock, and his mouth went dry. What? What do you mean? I will eliminate my father and marry my mother, he stammered. The words didn't make sense. How could such a terrible fate be his? The native doctor nodded solemnly. Yes. This is what the spirits have told me. You are bound by this destiny, and it is unavoidable unless you change your path. Patrick's mind raced as he struggled to understand the doctor's words. Eliminate my father? Marry my mother? The thought was terrifying and made no sense. He couldn't possibly hurt the people he loved. He needed to find a way to escape this fate. For the next few days, Patrick couldn't stop thinking about what the doctor had said. Every time he closed his eyes, those words echoed in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that the only way to stop the prophecy from coming true was to leave his family, leave the village, and never return. He told himself, I cannot stay here. If I stay, the prophecy will come true. I have to leave. One evening, when everyone had gone about their usual tasks, Patrick packed his belongings. He carefully folded his clothes, gathered his few possessions, and quietly snuck out of the house. His heart was heavy with sadness, but he knew he had to do this. He couldn't let the prophecy destroy his life, no matter how much it hurt. Patrick ran through the village, leaving the home he had known for so many years. He didn't look back as he made his way toward the unknown. His mind was set. He would go far away, to a place where he would never see his parents again. He believed that by cutting ties with them, he could change his future and avoid the terrible fate the native doctor had warned him about. What Patrick didn't know, however, was that the people he called father and mother were not really his parents at all. The truth about his birth and the prophecy had been kept from him. He had no idea that his life was connected to a much larger story, one that had been set into motion long before he was born. But for now, Patrick was determined to run, to escape the life he thought was his, and to start fresh somewhere far away. Patrick had no idea where he was going. His heart was heavy with the decision he had made to leave home, but he believed it was the only way to change his future. As he wandered down a lonely bush path, deep in thought, he came across an elderly man working in his farm. The man had a servant with him, and they seemed to be busy with their work. This old man, who was unknowingly Patrick's biological father, was none other than King Douglas. Patrick approached the man, hoping to get some directions. He greeted the elderly man politely and asked, "What village is this?" King Douglas stood up slowly, wiped his hands on his clothes, and looked Patrick over carefully. He squinted his eyes, as though trying to figure out something about this young man. "Who are you?" the king asked with a deep voice, curious about Patrick's presence. Patrick didn't respond, but instead asked again, "I'm just passing by. What village is this?" The king, now growing a little irritated, said, "You're a stranger, aren't you? You look like a man from a bush tribe. I don't like strangers coming around here. Go away." Patrick's temper, which he had struggled with for so long, flared up in an instant. His heart pounded with anger. The insult stung deeply, and before he could stop himself, he picked up a large stick nearby and struck the king across the chest. The king fell to the ground with a loud thud, lifeless. The servant, who had been watching the whole thing, rushed to defend the king. "What have you done?" the servant shouted. But Patrick, in his blind rage, turned toward the servant and eliminated him too, leaving him lying on the ground. Patrick stood there, breathing heavily, his anger slowly fading as the reality of what he had just done started to sink in. He quickly ran away from the scene, not knowing the consequences of his actions. The news of the king's death spread quickly through the village. People were in shock and deeply saddened. King Douglas, the ruler of EBUBE, was dead, and no one knew what would happen next. The village was now leaderless, vulnerable, and in mourning. But what the people of EBUBE didn't know was that the neighboring village had been watching. They saw this as a perfect opportunity to attack EBUBE, knowing that the village was weak without a king. The attack came suddenly. The people of EBUBE were unprepared and overwhelmed. As the battle raged on, Patrick, who had been wandering in the forest, heard the cries of the people. He saw the sadness and fear in their eyes, and something inside him stirred. He couldn't just walk away and let the village fall. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, rallying the people, motivating them to fight back. His natural leadership skills shone through, and with his guidance, the people of EBUBE found their courage. They pushed back the attackers and managed to win the fight, saving their village. The elders of EBUBE gathered to discuss the future of the village. They were grateful to Patrick for his bravery and leadership. Despite the fact that Patrick was not from EBUBE, they decided to make him their new king. He had proven himself to be strong, capable, and worthy of their trust. Patrick, though still shaken by the events that had unfolded, accepted the offer to become the king. His heart was heavy, but he knew this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. And as per the village's customs, Patrick was also married to Queen Margaret, the woman who was now to be his wife. What Patrick didn't know was that Queen Margaret, who had become his wife, was actually his real mother. He had unknowingly married the very woman who had once given birth to him, and had been forced to give him away to be raised by Uzo and Adiz. The prophecy that the native doctor had spoken all those years ago had come true in ways that Patrick could never have imagined. Patrick and Queen Margaret lived together in the palace, and they had 3 children together over the years. The village of EBUBE prospered under Patrick's rule. He ruled with wisdom and strength, but deep down, he could never fully escape the dark past that had shaped his life. But no matter what, Patrick was now the king of EBUBE, and he had done what he believed was necessary to change his future. Little did he know, the twists of fate were far from over, and his story was just beginning. Years passed, and EBUBE flourished under King Patrick's rule. The land was at peace, the people lived well, and everything seemed perfect. But one day, a mysterious sickness swept through the village. It started with the livestock, cattle, goats, and sheep, sickened and perished one by one. Then, even the crops began to wither. The elders grew worried and afraid. They knew something was terribly wrong. In desperation, the village elders gathered and decided to consult the chief priest. The chief priest was a man with deep knowledge of the spirits and the ancient ways of EBUBE. They hoped that he could find the cause of the sickness and give them a solution. After a long consultation, the chief priest came back with a grim message. He stood before the elders, his face pale and serious. "The person responsible for the death of the late king still lives among you," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of the words. The room fell silent, and the elders stared at one another in disbelief. King Patrick, hearing this, felt a chill run through him. He stood up and, with authority in his voice, declared, "I will find this murderer. When I do, I will pluck out his 2 eyes and send him to the evil forest to perish. No one will escape the consequences." Days passed, and Patrick continued to rule with a firm hand, but the mystery weighed heavily on his mind. Then, one day, during a meeting in the palace with the elders, something unexpected happened. The chief priest entered with an old man, Uzo, the hunter who had raised Patrick. Uzo had been silent about his past for many years, but now, it seemed, the time had come for the truth to be revealed. As everyone gathered, Uzo began to speak. The room was quiet as the hunter told the story of how he had found a small baby in the forest many years ago. He explained how the 2 palace guards, who had been ordered to eliminate the child, had left him in the forest, thinking he would perish. But Uzo had found him, taken him home, and raised him as his own son, believing him to be an abandoned child. The 2 guards, who had been present at the meeting, also spoke up. They confessed to the elders that they had felt pity for the baby and could not bring themselves to eliminate him. They had left him in the forest, thinking that he would perish, but instead, he had been saved by Uzo. The elders listened in shock as the truth of Patrick's past was finally revealed. The chief priest, with a heavy heart, then turned to King Patrick and delivered the final revelation. "You are the cause of the calamity in this land. The man you eliminated in the forest, the one who perished because of your temper, was the late King Douglas, your real father. And the woman you live with, Queen Margaret, is your biological mother." The room erupted in chaos. The elders shouted in disbelief, some crying out, "Abomination! Abomination!" The truth had finally come to light, and it was more than anyone could bear. Queen Margaret, who had lived through so much, heard the news and was overcome with shame. She could not bear the thought of the terrible truth. The weight of her actions, of giving birth to 3 children for her own son, was too much for her to handle. In her sorrow and guilt, she went to her room and, unable to live with the shame, took her own life. Patrick, hearing of his mother's tragic death, was devastated. He rushed to her room and found her lifeless body. His heart shattered, and the realization of what he had done crashed down on him. In his grief, Patrick knew that he was the cause of all the suffering in EBUBE. His anger and temper had set everything into motion, and now the land was cursed because of him. Patrick stood up, wiping away his tears, and announced to the elders, "Since I am the cause of this calamity, I will give myself the same punishment I had planned for the one who caused this pain. I will gouge out my own eyes and go to the evil forest, where I will remain until I perish." Without hesitation, Patrick went into his room, took a knife, and, with his own hands, gouged out his eyes, just as he had promised. He called for the guards, who had watched him for years, and ordered them to escort him to the evil forest. The guards, with heavy hearts, obeyed their king's final wish. They took Patrick to the forest, and he wandered in darkness, alone with his thoughts. As he walked through the dense trees, he reflected on the pain he had caused, the people he had hurt, and the fate that had come to pass because of his actions. A few days later, the sickness that had plagued EBUBE was gone. The land seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if the curse had been lifted with Patrick's sacrifice. The people of the village knew that the events that had unfolded would never be forgotten, but they also knew that a new beginning was on the horizon. The elders, in their wisdom, decided to appoint a new king to lead EBUBE. They chose a man who was fair, wise, and compassionate, a king who could restore peace and order to the land. And so, the story of Patrick, the king who unknowingly eliminated his father and married his mother, came to an end. His sacrifice was remembered as a lesson of humility and the consequences of unchecked anger. Umudike, now cleansed of its calamity, moved forward into a new era, where the mistakes of the past would guide the future.